Hey, thank you, Ufa. So now that we've seen the effects of the current supply chain and the delays that can happen, I've been thinking about 95 plus ships off the coast of California and throughout the supply chain. We get to see a clear picture that these delays, including abandoned cargo, when looking at stabilized cargoes that do have a certain shelf life of stabilization, could have some potential consequences if they're further delayed. So what I'd like to do is take a brief look at the Flaminia incident to try to frame what the actual situation and problem may be when we're looking at stabilized cargoes that may be delayed or abandoned. Divinyl benzene was found by the court. Next slide, please. So looking at the Flaminia incident, divinyl benzene was a cargo that was found by the court to be the case of the explosion and fire on the Flaminia. The manufacturer of the DVB was stabilized via chemical inhibitor in order to prevent autopolymerization. Even when chemically inhibited, however, the DVB had to be protected from heat and have access to sufficient oxygen to prevent autopolymerization. Prior to the casualty voyage, the manufacturer had experienced a number of incidents when its DVB, which was chemically inhibited, had nevertheless autopolymerized, causing the release of flammable vapors while in transportation. As a result of these incidents, the manufacturer developed procedures to prevent future autopolymerization of its DVB during transportation. These procedures included increasing available oxygen by increasing headspace in the tank, chilling the DVB prior to loading it into the tank containers, reducing the transit time by routing shipments of DVB through the northern U.S. port of New York instead of New Orleans during warm periods of the year, instructing their NVOCC not to deliver the cargo any longer than 4 days prior to loading, to notify carriers to stow DVB shipments in stack or below deck to avoid exposure to direct sunlight, do not stow near heat, and requiring that DVB not be loaded aboard vessels if the temperature was at or above 27 degrees centigrade. Next, please. The manufacturer provided all of this information, including past incidents, to the tank NVOCC. Tank NVOCC, acting as the shipper to the ocean carrier, booked the shipment as UN 3082, environmentally hazardous substances, liquid NOS class 9. No indication that the material was stabilized and subject to autopolymerization, and although it was stabilized, that additional operational controls were necessary to ensure safe transport was provided to the carrier. The NVOCC then delivered the shipment to New Orleans 10 days prior to loading. As the booking was not yet completed, the shipment was held at the gate, at which time the NVOCC completed the booking and received the okay from the manufacturer for early delivery. The ambient temperature at the time in New Orleans was on average 91 degrees Fahrenheit or 32.7 centigrade. Several days before sailing, several tanks of an undeclared molten cargo were stored adjacent to the DVB tank. After 10 days of temporary storage on the terminal, in direct sunlight, and before any check of the cargo temperature was made, the tank was loaded. The vessel subsequently sailed to Mobile, Alabama, Freeport, Bahamas, Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, then on to Antwerp. 2 days before delivery in Antwerp, the cargo autopolymerized, releasing flammable gases, and subsequently exploded, causing fire. Next, please. The manufacturer and tank NVOCC were ultimately found at fault by the U.S. District Court, Southern District of New York. The court found that substantial contributing factors led to the DVB's autopolymerization, which included the decision to ship DVB out of New Orleans, which necessitated a longer voyage than would have warned northern port and exposed it to undesirable conditions. The fact that the DVB-80 was left still on the dock at New Orleans for 10 days in the sun and hot weather next to a number of tanks of heated DPA. the placement of DVB in hold 4 where it was stored next to containers of heated DPA and near ship's heated fuel tanks, and lack of proper ventilation. In the aftermath, when the shipper was asked why the carrier was not informed that the material was subject to autopolymerization or why none of the operational controls were passed on, they basically stated that they provided the minimum regulatory information provided by the code. Here, one has to wonder that if the carrier had been informed of the operational controls, if the tank would have been accepted in the terminal in New Orleans 10 days prior to loading, and or if the cargo temperature had been checked prior to loading, if it would have been loaded at all. So let's take a brief look at the IMDG code provisions surrounding stabilized substances and perhaps the lack of requirements to fully disclose potential critical safety information. Next, please. So in section 1.1.3.1, we find the IMDG code forbids inherently unstable substances or articles from transport. These are cargoes which, as presented for transport, are liable to explode, dangerously react, produce a flame, or dangerous evolution of heat, dangerous emission of toxic, corrosive, flammable gases, or vapors under normal conditions of transport. Next, please. 3.1.1.3, however, goes on to say that while inherent instability may lead to the explosion and polymerization with intense evolution of heat or emission of flammable gas, toxic, corrosive, asphyxiant gases, this does not mean that such goods may not be transported under any circumstances. For most goods, such inherent stability can be controlled by suitable packaging, dilution, stabilization, additional inhibitor, temperature control, or other measures. Other measures are not defined. In section 3.1.5 then goes on that certain substances tend to polymerize or otherwise react in dangerous manner when certain conditions of temperature or in contact with a catalyst. Mitigation of this tendency can be carried out either by requiring special transport conditions or by adding adequate amounts of chemical inhibitors or stabilizers. The IMDG code provides various UN numbers and proper shipping names for cargoes requiring stabilization. Polymerizing substances NOS provides an example of those cargoes that can be inherently unstable. There are many other similar monomers and substances listed in the code, styrene monomer, for instance. In the aftermath of the Flaminia, IMO developed and assigned a new special provision to stabilize substances, and perhaps gives us further insight as to what some of those other measures or special transport conditions may apply. SP 386 basically requires that when a chemical stabilization is employed, the person offering the shipment must ensure that the level of stabilization is sufficient to prevent substances from dangerous polymerization at a bulk mean temperature, or SAPT, of 50 degrees centigrade, or 45 degrees centigrade for a portable tank container. Where chemical stabilization becomes ineffective at lower temperatures, meaning below 50 C or 45 C, within the anticipated duration of the transport, temperature control is required. However, in making the determination, operational controls and other measures may be considered. In effect, this indicates that if the stabilization may begin to become ineffective at lower temperatures, that operational controls may be considered and utilized to ensure proper stabilization. Next slide, please. In making the determination of whether or not temperature control is necessary, the special provision goes on to provide some limited factors that may be taken into consideration. The factors provided in the SP include, but it should be noted that the SP does not limit them to, the capacity and geometry of the packaging, IBC, or tank, and effect of any insulation present, the temperature of the substance when offered for transport, the duration of the journey and the ambient temperature conditions typically encountered in the journey, considering the time of year, the effectiveness and other properties of the stabilizer employed, applicable operational controls imposed by regulation. The SP then goes on to provide an example of what these may be by stating requirements to protect away from sources of heat, including other cargo transported at temperatures above ambient, and any other relevant factors. There are no examples of what any other relevant factors may include. In effect, the special provision permits operational controls where considered effective to be substituted for active mechanical temperature control for materials where stabilization becomes ineffective below an SAPT of 50 or 45 C for tanks within the anticipated transport. Therefore, operational controls may be used by a shipper in some instances to stabilize cargoes. However, there is no provision in the IMDG code that requires the shipper to divulge to the carrier what operational controls were considered and/or employed. Furthermore, the code does not require the shipper to provide the SAPT of the substance transported, which would at minimum provide the carrier with an indication of at what temperature the shipment may begin to polymerize. Next slide, please. Given the current state of the supply chain, it would certainly appear that there is cause for concern. With current delays well exceeding anticipated journeys, it's not hard to imagine that there may well be shipments in the supply chain that are exceeding the anticipated transport time and/or ambient temperatures that may have been considered by shippers to ensure adequate stabilization. The lack of any requirements of shippers to divulge SAPT and operational controls that may have been considered and implemented to properly stabilize the shipments could potentially lead to unintended consequences. At minimum, if carriers were aware of these factors, they would be able to ensure proper handling, safe stowage on board, collaborate and provide input on anticipated expectations, detect if those controls are not fully implemented, and begin emergency protocols when the parameters of the controls are nearing expiration or are exceeded. Next, please. So perhaps it's time to take a look at updating the IMDG code to include provisions for providing carriers the SAPT and any operational controls implemented for stabilized transport. I would again like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thanks.